Hey everyone, tonight we're drifting back to a softer, stranger corner of history. So, dim the lights, take a slow breath, and settle in with me. Before we begin, let me know in the comments, where are you listening from tonight? Are you cozy in bed, maybe on a long late-night drive, or just letting this play in the background while you unwind? I always love seeing where in the world these stories find you. And if you enjoy these quiet wanderings through history, don't forget to share this with a friend who might need a gentle story to fall asleep to. It helps more than you know. All right, let's drift into a story that is as human as it is holy, or perhaps as unholy as it is human. Because while the church insisted on vows of celibacy, while it thundered from pulpits about chastity, about purity, about resisting the temptations of the flesh, the reality behind monastery doors and within Vatican chambers was often much less saintly. Priests could not resist, popes could not resist, and monks, locked away in cloisters, were often less pious than people like to imagine. This isn't the fire and brimstone version of history. Tonight, we're not here to cast judgment. We're just taking a long, calm stroll through a world where priests lectured against sin by day and then slipped into velvet sheets at night, where popes signed bulls of excommunication with one hand and kept mistresses tucked away in their papal apartments with the other. It's a story full of contradictions, gentle ones, human ones, embarrassing ones, because even in the most sacred spaces, lust tended to wander in. Let's begin with the simple fact. Celibacy wasn't always a thing. In the early centuries of the church, priests could marry. Bishops had wives, even popes occasionally had children who were not the result of immaculate anything. It wasn't until later, around the 11th and 12th centuries, that celibacy became strictly enforced and, as we'll see, strictly enforced often translated into strictly ignored. The Council of Elvira, in the 4th century, had already muttered something about clergy abstaining from sex. But it was more of a strong suggestion than a universal law. Centuries later, by the time reformers like Pope Gregory VII came around, the official line hardened. Priests should renounce marriage, wives should be sent away, mistresses abandoned. Naturally, that made the problem worse. Tell people they cannot do something, and of course, many will find ways to do it anyway. And priests were no different. Take Pope Sergius III, for instance. He ruled in the early 10th century, during a period historians sometimes call the Pornocracy, name that really tells you everything you need to know. Sergius became pope in 904 and was widely believed to have taken a mistress named Marozia, who herself was a noblewoman with far more influence than most men of the era. Their relationship was less discreet than one might imagine, and allegedly produced a child who would later become Pope John Abascand. Yes, that's right. The supposed son of a pope and his mistress would one day wear the tiara himself. The Holy See became a kind of family business, and not a particularly subtle one. The irony, of course, is that papal bulls from that same century sternly reminded priests and bishops that they must resist temptation. Meanwhile, temptation had already taken up residence in the Vatican palace, and Sergius was far from alone. Let's drift over to Pope Alexander VI, better known as Rodrigo Borgia. If there was ever a pope who made no pretense about his vices, it was Alexander. He openly acknowledged his children, several of them in fact. His daughter Lucrezia and son Cesare became infamous figures in Renaissance politics, their names whispered in stories of poison rings and family feuds. Alexander had a long-term mistress, Vanozza de Catane, and later a younger lover, Julia Farnese, who was barely a teenager when she entered his household. The Pope's palace in Rome wasn't exactly known for quiet prayer during his reign. Banquets, theatrics, affairs, this was a papacy lived out like a Renaissance soap opera, with Alexander as the leading man who just happened to hold the keys of St. Peter. Church critics didn't have to dig very hard. The evidence was right there. While priests in small towns were punished for having concubines, the Pope himself was fathering children in broad daylight. But perhaps the strangest part of all this was how normalized it became. Mistresses of the clergy were sometimes even given a name: priests' housekeepers. A polite euphemism, of course. The local bishop might thunder against fornication in a sermon, then return home to the woman everyone politely pretended was his maid. Monasteries, too, were not immune. Far from being cloisters of endless prayer, many became places of scandal. By the later Middle Ages, chronicles and court records are full of stories about monks sneaking out at night, abbots keeping unofficial wives, and nuns whose convents functioned less like spiritual retreats and more like places of lively, let's call it, social activity. There's a famous case from 16th century Spain where an entire convent of nuns was discovered to be functioning as a disguised brothel. The authorities were scandalized, though, in fairness, not particularly surprised. Of course, indulgence wasn't always limited to quiet affairs. Sometimes it spilled into the streets. In the 13th century, Bishop Rüdiger of Würzburg was accused of running an actual brothel. Imagine that your local shepherd of souls doubling as the manager of a rather different flock. Contemporary chroniclers recorded the scandal with barely concealed delight. And he wasn't an outlier. Records from medieval cities show priests frequenting brothels in large numbers. In fact, in places like Paris, it was common enough that the brothel owners kept special rooms reserved for clerics. It was less an open secret than just a regular Tuesday. Naturally, reformers tried to crack down. Laws were passed, decrees were issued. Bishops wagged fingers at priests, but the cycle repeated itself endlessly. Prohibition on one hand, indulgence on the other. Even the supposedly holy orders, those monks who took extra vows of poverty and chastity, often became legendary for their inability to resist temptation. The Cistercians were known for their austerity, their plain monasteries, their silence. Yet chronicles tell of more than a few who found their silence broken by less pious noises at night. And then there were the Benedictines. Their abbots sometimes lived like princes, with servants, feasts, and private quarters where certain women appeared with suspicious regularity. We shouldn't imagine all monasteries as dens of vice. Many were genuinely devoted to prayer, to charity, to study, but enough of them slipped into scandal to make the satirist's job very easy. Medieval poets loved to write little verses mocking monks for drinking, gambling, and chasing women, because of course they did. One of the most striking contradictions was how the Church handled the children born of these secret or not-so-secret relationships. Technically, they were illegitimate, but if your father happened to be a bishop, you were often set up quite nicely in life. Many clerical sons were quietly funneled into lucrative church positions themselves. Some popes even created dynasties. The Borgias were the most famous, but they weren't alone. Pope Innocent VIII openly acknowledged his children, giving them positions and marrying them into prominent families. His papacy might have been spiritually questionable, but politically, it was a shrewd use of fatherhood. It's almost comical. Popes preaching against lust while proudly arranging marriages for their own offspring. The contradictions barely needed pointing out, and yet, for all the hypocrisy, there's something very human about it. These were men placed in positions of extraordinary authority, sworn to lives of extraordinary restraint. It's not entirely shocking that many failed to live up to the standard. The surprise is less that it happened, and more that it happened so constantly, so predictably, and often so brazenly. The Church's opponents, Protestant reformers, especially would later seize on this history with glee. When Martin Luther launched his criticisms in the early 16th century, he had centuries of scandal to point to. Monks with mistresses, bishops with brothels, popes with illegitimate children. It was a ready-made case file against the institution. But tonight, we're not here to make theological arguments. We're here to let the irony wash over us, gently. To picture a candlelit Vatican chamber where a pope knelt in prayer before stepping into the adjoining room where his mistress waited. To imagine monks in their grey habits sneaking through town at night, hoping no one noticed. To picture bishops standing at the pulpit, preaching purity to parishioners who already knew exactly who the bishop's housekeeper was. History is full of contradictions, and this particular contradiction, the vow of celibacy alongside the endless reality of temptation, is one of its most quietly amusing. So let's drift onward into more stories of priests who could not resist, of popes who indulged, and of monasteries where the cloistered walls were no barrier to human desire. So, we've already lingered with the Borgias and the early medieval chaos. Let's now drift gently forward into the Renaissance. Because if you thought things might get holier once the world entered an age of humanist learning, marble statues, and refined culture, well, no. If anything, the contradictions grew even more spectacular. Let's start with Pope Julius II, known to history as the warrior pope. And no, that isn't a metaphor. Julius wasn't content to simply bless armies from the safety of the Vatican. He led them in full armor, riding into battle, swinging swords, shouting orders. Imagine the spiritual successor of St. Peter dressed more like a mercenary captain from a Shakespeare play. Of course, leading troops wasn't Julius's only extracurricular interest. Whispers circulated about his fondness for young men, many of them artists or soldiers in his service. Michelangelo's. The Michelangelo endured years of tension with Julius while painting the Sistine Chapel ceiling. Some chroniclers suggested the Pope's temperamental affection for handsome assistants went beyond artistic patronage. The irony, of course, was that Julius thundered loudly against corruption, just not his own. He marched armies to enforce papal authority, all while Vatican halls were alive with the gossip of his preferences. To the average observer, Julius's life looked less like celibate holiness and more like an exhausting soap opera in armor. Then there were the Medici popes. The Medicis, Florence's bankers turned rulers turned clerics. They didn't just dominate Tuscan politics, they exported their family drama to Rome. Take Pope Leo X, son of Lorenzo de' Medici, the famous Lorenzo the Magnificent. Leo had grown up in the palaces of Florence, surrounded by art, poetry, and the occasional assassination attempt. He became pope in 1513 and almost immediately treated the papacy as though it were his private festival. he once remarked, quite casually. "Since God has given us the papacy, let us enjoy it." And enjoy it he did. Leo loved hunting, theatre, banquets, and, naturally, the company of attractive young men. He filled the Vatican with performers, jesters, and courtiers. Papal accounts from his reign are full of gifts that look suspiciously like allowances for lovers. His contemporaries grumbled that Rome had become one long party under his rule. The same Leo X, of course, was the Pope who condemned Martin Luther and his 95 Theses. The man who railed against indulgence while funding Vatican festivities through, you guessed it, selling indulgences. The contradictions practically wrote themselves. Let's float now to Pope Clement VII, also a Medici. His reign was less decadent and more disastrous. Clement managed to alienate both France and the Holy Roman Empire, which ended badly in 1527 when imperial troops sacked Rome. The city was devastated. The Vatican was looted. Nuns were assaulted in the streets, monks slaughtered, priests humiliated. And yet, throughout his reign, Clement's court was filled with the same kinds of indulgent whispers. Mistresses, nephews with suspiciously advantageous positions, clerical children tucked away in cushy church offices. One might almost feel sorry for him, except that much of the disaster was, in fact, his own making. By the 16th century, the problem of clerical vice had become so undeniable that the Church tried, once again, to reform. The Council of Trent, convened in 1545, was supposed to address the corruption. Bishops gathered, theologians argued, decrees were issued. Priests were told firmly this time that concubinage must stop. Seminaries were established to ensure better training. And did it work? Well, partially. The official line grew stricter. Punishments became harsher. Parish priests were increasingly expected to at least maintain appearances. But scandals did not vanish. They merely became more discreet, more carefully managed, more quietly buried in archives. Because temptation didn't pack its bags after Trent, it never really does. Let's pause for a softer picture. Imagine a small village in Renaissance Italy. The parish priest lives in the rectory beside the church, and living with him is a woman always described as his housekeeper. She cooks for him, tends the home, and occasionally gives birth to children who bear a suspicious resemblance to their supposed employer. The villagers nod, smile, and keep quiet. Because everyone knows, and no one really wants to push the issue. This was not unusual. In fact, across Europe, parish records quietly show baptisms of children whose fathers were priests. Sometimes the names were disguised. Sometimes the connection was obvious. Local communities often tolerated it, because at least the priest was stable, predictable, even domestic in his own way. It's one of those quietly amusing truths, the official vow of celibacy, sternly enforced from Rome, often crumbled in the face of village life. People cared more that the priest was around to say Mass than whether he was sneaking into the bedroom after Compline. Meanwhile, at the higher levels of the church, indulgence sometimes went hand in hand with politics. Cardinal Ippolito d'Este, for instance, was less remembered for his sermons and more for building the splendid Villa d'Este in Tivoli complete, with fountains, gardens, and, yes, private apartments well suited for entertaining. His reputation for pleasure-seeking was so well known that satirists barely bothered to mock him. Even within the supposedly reformed Counter-Reformation Church, rumors never ceased. Jesuits preached discipline, while bishops quietly maintained their lovers. Nuns penned mystical treatises by day, while scandalous investigations revealed liaisons by night. The gap between the spiritual ideal and the human reality remained as wide as ever, and it wasn't just Rome. Let's drift northward to medieval and early modern England. Before Henry VIII broke with Rome, clerical celibacy was just as shaky there. Parish priests often lived with concubines. Some even kept them in official church housing. In York, records show fines levied against priests who openly lived with women, and the fines were paid so frequently that it became little more than a clerical tax. When the Reformation came, Protestant reformers gleefully pointed out this hypocrisy. They argued that forced celibacy was unnatural, impossible, and destined to breed corruption. And in truth, the evidence supported them. Even devout Catholics privately admitted that the system was not exactly working as intended. Let's return, though, to Rome. Because there's something oddly soothing about picturing papal apartments filled with contradictions. A pope blessing the faithful in St. Peter's, then retiring to his chambers where his mistress waited. Cardinals thundering against sin, then leaving the pulpit to sneak into discreet gardens with companions. The architecture itself witnessed the irony. Marble halls echoing with sacred chants by day, laughter and music by night. Statues of saints looking down on banquets that would have shocked them. And through it all, the business of the church continued. Bulls were issued, councils convened. Souls were saved, or at least tallied. Holiness and indulgence lived side by side, never fully reconciled, never fully hidden, but somehow always continuing. It's tempting to ask, why didn't it stop? Why, despite endless decrees, councils, punishments, and scandals, did priests and popes keep indulging? The answer is almost disarmingly simple. They were human. Placed under vows that denied the most basic human desires, cloistered in power that gave them opportunity, surrounded by wealth that offered comfort, many clergy gave in. The structure was designed for failure, and so failure became routine. It wasn't universal, of course. There were priests who lived lives of sincere devotion, monks who truly embraced poverty and chastity, nuns who never wavered. But the scandals survived because they were constant enough to never disappear. Tonight, though, we don't need to dwell on morality. We can simply let the contradictions unfold, one after another, like a slow parade of irony. Popes in armor, cardinals in banquets, parish priests with housekeepers, monks slipping through cloisters at night. History is not tidy. It's not pure. It's not the polished story told in stained glass. It's much more human, much more fallible, and, when you step back, much more quietly amusing. So let's keep wandering. There are more tales waiting of priests who ran taverns, of abbots who lived like princes, of popes whose love affairs shaped politics as much as theology. So, we've spent some time with popes in armor, cardinals at banquets, and bishops with housekeepers. But let's zoom back down to the smaller stage now, to the parish level, where ordinary priests were meant to live lives of modest service. Because if the Vatican was a theater of grand contradiction, the village parish was often its cozy local comedy. Imagine for a moment a small German town in the 15th century. The parish priest stands at the pulpit on Sunday, wagging his finger at his congregation. He warns against the sins of gluttony, drunkenness, and lust. He reminds his flock to resist temptation, to remain pure, to confess regularly. Then, after Mass, He strolls down the road and unlocks the door of the local tavern, which happens to be his own side business. Yes, priests ran taverns. More often than you'd think. In records from the period, you can find complaints from bishops that certain priests were too busy serving wine to tend to the altar. Some even brewed their own beer. It was lucrative, it was popular, and it was, of course, utterly inappropriate. But it happened anyway. Because who better to run the local inn than the man already at the center of the community? He had space, he had authority, and most importantly, he had customers who trusted him. It may not have been holy, but it was practical. And if priests were moonlighting as tavern keepers, they were also sometimes moonlighting in bedrooms. Parish records reveal a steady stream of clerical children. Some were baptized openly, with the priest as godfather of his own offspring, a wink everyone understood. Others were left unnamed, their fathers' identities treated as a polite mystery. There's a famous case in 15th century England where one bishop became so frustrated that he issued fines to priests for keeping concubines. The fines poured in with such regularity that, rather than eliminating the problem, it turned into a steady income stream for the diocese. Sin, in other words, became self-funding. Of course, the monasteries weren't doing much better. Let's drift into a convent, not a mystical place of endless prayer, but a bustling house full of women who were often placed there by families more interested in saving dowries than saving souls. Some convents became genuine centers of devotion. Others, not so much. Take the notorious case in 16th century Spain where investigators discovered that an entire convent had effectively become a brothel. Visitors were welcomed freely. Vows were ignored, and the nuns were living lives that could only be described as entrepreneurial. The scandal was hushed up, but not before it made its way into Protestant propaganda pamphlets. And they weren't the only ones. Convent scandals pop up again and again in the record Sabbaces accused of keeping lovers, nuns escaping at night, and, in one memorable case, a convent in Italy where the sisters were found to be operating a secret wine business on the side. It turns out that cloistered walls were not particularly effective against either lust or capitalism. If monasteries and convents struggled, abbots often set the tone. Some were genuinely ascetic. Others lived like petty princes. They wore rich robes, dined on elaborate meals, and kept private quarters where, naturally, visitors of a certain kind appeared. The wealth of abbots became so notorious that satirists began to write poems mocking their hypocrisy. In France, ballads circulated about monks sneaking out to gamble, abbots bedding local women, and friars who seemed to have far more interest in taverns than in scripture. The humor was gentle but cutting because everyone knew there was truth behind the rhyme. And then came the Reformation. If you were a Protestant reformer, these scandals were your dream material. Martin Luther himself had been a monk. He knew firsthand the challenges of celibacy. He openly argued that enforced chastity was unnatural, impossible, and doomed to failure. And to prove his point, he collected story after story of clerical failure. Protestant pamphlets gleefully published lurid accounts of papal mistresses, priestly children, convent scandals, and brothel-keeping bishops. Sometimes they exaggerated. Sometimes they didn't need to. The sheer volume of real examples gave them endless ammunition. One pamphlet from the 1520s portrayed the Pope as the literal whore of Babylon, surrounded by courtesans and dripping with jewels. Another recounted tales of nuns seduced by their confessors. These stories weren't just gossip, they were powerful propaganda. They painted the Catholic Church as an institution drowning in its own hypocrisy. And the thing is, a lot of people believed them, because they sounded, quite frankly, entirely plausible. The Catholic Church fought back, of course. Counter-Reformation writers accused Protestants of slander, exaggeration, and malice. And no doubt, many of the pamphlets were embellished. But at the core, the accusations had weight. Everyone knew priests kept concubines. Everyone knew bishops had illegitimate children. Everyone knew the Vatican had seen its share of mistresses. So the Church was forced to act. The Council of Trent, as we mentioned earlier, tried to tighten discipline. Bishops were ordered to live in their dioceses rather than lounging in Rome. Seminaries were established to train priests properly. Rules about concubinage were repeated sternly, endlessly. And for a time, things did improve. Scandals became less brazen, less open. But did they disappear? Of course not. Temptation never really leaves. Let's soften the focus again. Imagine a small convent in France, late 17th century. The nuns sing vespers by candlelight. Their chants echo through the stone chapel. But after the prayers, behind closed doors, the abbess entertains a gentleman visitor who enters through a side gate. The sisters know, the villagers suspect, but no one says much. Because the convent provides charity, runs a school, and supports the town. Why cause trouble? Or picture an abbot in Austria living in a grand residence, dining on silver, sipping wine from his own vineyards, and quietly fathering children who are raised with generous allowances. The hypocrisy is real, but it is also routine, almost dull in its predictability. That's the strange comfort of these stories. They don't shock after a while. They simply confirm what history so often reminds us. People, even holy people, are people first. And it wasn't only Catholics. As Protestant ministers replaced Catholic priests in much of Europe, they too sometimes struggled with chastity. Though, conveniently, most were allowed to marry. Scandals still arose, but they were less about secret mistresses and more about inconvenient marriages, financial entanglements, and, of course, the occasional affair. It turns out that sin, like water, finds its way through any cracks in the system. By the 18th century, Europe had almost grown comfortable with clerical hypocrisy. Satirical novels, plays, and cartoons mocked lecherous monks, scheming abbesses, and worldly bishops. Audiences laughed knowingly, because none of it was surprising anymore. The Church continued to insist on its ideals. Reformers continued to decry its failures, and in between, ordinary people kept watching, half amused, half resigned, as priests preached one thing and practiced another. So where does that leave us tonight? We've wandered from popes with mistresses to priests with taverns, from convent scandals to Protestant pamphlets. We've seen hypocrisy on a grand stage and in tiny villages, and always the same pattern emerges. Vows made, vows broken, and everyone pretending, at least for a little while, that nothing was happening. It's strangely soothing in its way. A reminder that history is not just about battles and treaties, but about ordinary human failings, sometimes dressed in velvet robes, sometimes cloaked in monastic habits. And as we drift forward into the next part, we'll explore how these indulgences shaped politics, how clerical children quietly influenced dynasties, and how the Church's reputation weathered century after century of whispered scandal. We've wandered through tavern-keeping priests and convents that forgot what vows were for. But tonight, let's settle into an even more curious theme. What happens when men sworn to celibacy produce children? Because despite the official line that clerics were to live lives of abstinence, the reality was that many of them became fathers, and not in the metaphorical, "my son, bless you" sense, in the practical, cradle by the bedside sense. And when the fathers in question were powerful bishops, cardinals, or popes, those children often grew up with lives that were anything but obscure. Take Pope Innocent VIII. He reigned from 1484 to 1492 and was the first pope to openly acknowledge his children. Not just quietly, not with a nod and a wink, but officially, by name. He arranged marriages for them, secured them fortunes, and placed them in advantageous positions. One of his daughters married into the Medici family. Another married a Roman noble. His sons were granted lucrative posts. Innocent wasn't even embarrassed. He lived as though being both pope and patriarch was perfectly normal, which in practice it was. The irony, of course, was that during his reign, the Church continued to thunder against illegitimacy. For ordinary folk, having children outside wedlock meant stigma, hardship, and social exclusion. For the Pope, it meant forging alliances. And then, of course, there were the Borgias. Rodrigo Borgia, as Pope Alexander VI, didn't just father children. He turned them into players on the grand stage of Renaissance politics. His son, Cesare Borgia, was made a cardinal at an absurdly young age, though he eventually cast aside the cassock for armor, becoming one of the most ruthless military commanders of his age. His daughter, Lucrezia Borgia, became infamous, sometimes unfairly for her multiple marriages, whispered affairs, and rumored poison rings. Were all the stories true? Probably not. Protestant propagandists gleefully exaggerated the scandals. But at the heart of it, the truth remained. The Pope had openly raised a family, and that family helped shape Italian politics for decades. One could almost admire the efficiency. Alexander VI didn't just ignore the rules, he rewrote them for himself. Other popes took a subtler approach. Pope Paul III, for instance, reigned from 1534 to 1549. He had fathered 4 children before taking holy orders, children he never exactly abandoned. In fact, he elevated 2 of his grandsons to the cardinalate. One of them, Alessandro Farnese, became one of the wealthiest and most powerful cardinals of the century. Paul III also presided over the Council of Trent, the very council meant to reform the Church's corruption. It's difficult not to smile at the irony. A pope who had used nepotism shamelessly was now the figurehead of reform. Of course, history is full of such contradictions. It's almost the natural rhythm of institutions: abuse, scandal, reform, repeat. And it wasn't just popes. Bishops across Europe routinely passed on wealth, property, and titles to their children. Officially illegitimate, these sons and daughters were often quietly legitimized by papal decree. It was astonishingly convenient. If your father was a bishop, all it took was the right signature from Rome, and suddenly your birth was no longer a problem. In some cases, clerical sons went on to become clerics themselves. Entire dynasties of celibate fathers and sons sprang up, each generation inheriting lucrative benefices and church positions. It was celibacy in name, heredity in practice. One particularly amusing example is the case of Cardinal Giulio de' Medici. He was the illegitimate son of Giuliano de' Medici, himself a cleric. Giulio was legitimized by Pope Leo Xanother Medici, naturally, and eventually became Pope Clement VII. So here we have it, a pope born out of clerical celibacy's failure, legitimized by a pope who was his relative, ruling as pope himself. A dynasty of contradictions, wearing crimson robes. The web of clerical families spread wide. In Renaissance Italy, noble families often maneuvered to have one son enter the church, partly for spiritual prestige, but mostly for power and income. These celibate sons frequently fathered children anyway, and those children became another thread in the family's political fabric. So when we look at the history of Europe, we can't separate dynastic politics from clerical scandals. The lines between sacred and secular blurred constantly. Papal bastards married into noble houses. Bishops' children became dukes. Priests' sons became abbots, all under the thin veil of celibacy that everyone knew was routinely ignored. Let's picture a quieter scene. A 16th century bishop in Germany. Officially, he is celibate. Unofficially, he keeps a household that looks suspiciously like a family. A woman described as his cook, 3 children who all bear his distinctive nose, and a staff of servants who politely ignore the obvious. When he dies, his cook receives a generous pension, the children are settled into respectable marriages, and the whole affair is noted in diocesan records with a kind of weary familiarity. No outrage, no scandal, just another bishop who couldn't resist. For ordinary priests, the story was more precarious. Their children often lived in an ambiguous space, acknowledged but not celebrated. Some became craftsmen, others clerics themselves. A few, if their fathers were generous or well-connected, rose to positions of real influence. There's a faint sadness to it. The official church denied their legitimacy, but their fathers' status sometimes shielded them. They lived in a twilight between secrecy and recognition, not quite hidden, not quite embraced. One of the more notorious dynastic tangles came with Pope Julius III. He reigned in the mid-16th century and is remembered less for theology and more for his suspiciously close relationship with a teenage boy named Innocenzo. Julius adopted Innocenzo as his nephew, a term that, in papal households, was often a convenient cover for something else. He showered him with titles, wealth, and offices, despite Innocenzo's lack of any real qualifications. The Roman elite whispered. The satirists had a field day, and Julius's reputation sank. Innocenzo, for his part, repaid the generosity by murdering a man in a drunken brawl. Not exactly a model of papal virtue. This kind of favoritism, blending family, affection, and scandal, was exactly what the Protestant reformers pointed to with gleeful outrage. And once again, they didn't have to invent very much. The children of priests and popes left their fingerprints across European culture too. Some became patrons of the arts, others commissioned buildings, still others maneuvered in politics. In some cases, they carried the family name with pride. In others, they lived quietly, shadows of the contradiction that had created them, but they remind us of an essential truth. Vows did not stop life from continuing. The official doctrine may have said no, but human nature rarely obeys decrees. By the 17th and 18th centuries, clerical dynasties had become less blatant, but they didn't vanish. Nepotism remained rampant. Cardinals still appointed nephews, cousins, and, let's be honest, illegitimate children to cushy positions. The papal courts continued to hum with whispers, and yet, by then, the scandal felt less shocking. Europe had seen it all before. The joke was familiar. The hypocrisy was baked into the system. It's strangely comforting in a way. These stories remind us that history is not a tale of pure ideals, but of flawed people trying, failing, and carrying on. Popes were fathers, bishops were grandfathers, priests were tavern keepers with children in the back room, and through it all, the Church survived. The scandals dented its reputation, yes. The Reformation split it apart, certainly. But the institution remained. The contradiction never fully destroyed it. Perhaps that is the most human element of all, the ability to stumble, to fail, to be exposed, and yet to persist. So as we drift deeper, let's follow this thread into the broader cultural landscape. How did the world outside the church poets, satirists, common folk respond to the spectacle of holy men with unholy hobbies? How did literature, theatre, and gossip shape the memory of these indulgent clerics? That's where we'll float next. So far, we've lingered inside the cloisters, the papal chambers, and the rectories. But the truth is, none of this stayed hidden for very long. Because ordinary people talked, they noticed, they joked, and perhaps most dangerously for the Church's reputation, poets and satirists put it all into verse. If priests and popes couldn't resist their temptations, the people couldn't resist laughing about it. Let's begin in the Middle Ages, where street songs were the social media of the day. In taverns and marketplaces, minstrels sang cheeky ballads about monks who spent more time at the alehouse than at the altar, or abbots whose psalms were suspiciously interrupted by visits from women. One popular theme was the friar, who specialized in hearing confessions from attractive wives taking a little too much interest in their sins of the flesh. The humor was always gentle, a little bawdy, and very familiar. Everyone in the crowd knew at least one priest who fit the description. It wasn't exactly theology. It was folk wisdom. Priests preach, priests fail, and people laugh. By the Renaissance, satire had sharpened. Humanist writers, educated in Latin and Greek, used classical styles to poke fun at clerical hypocrisy. Erasmus of Rotterdam, for instance, wrote In Praise of Folly, a little book that mocked the foolishness of all society, but reserved special scorn for greedy bishops and lustful monks. He didn't invent the criticism, he just gave it a literary polish. Readers chuckled knowingly. After all, they'd seen it all before. In Italy, the theatre took up the theme. Plays regularly featured lecherous friars as comic stock characters, men of the cloth who were always scheming after money, wine, or women. Audiences roared with laughter because the joke was obvious. The pious exterior never matched the messy reality inside. The same motif spread into French farce. In Paris, traveling players staged little comedies where bumbling priests bumbled a bit too eagerly into bedrooms. The audience laughed not only at the character, but at the familiarity. Everyone knew priests like that existed, even if the church pretended otherwise. Visual satire flourished too. In the age of printing, woodcuts became the meme of the 16th century. Pamphlets circulated with images of monks and nuns in compromising situations, sometimes exaggerated, sometimes just barely embellished. Protestant reformers, especially, used these prints to devastating effect. One famous German woodcut showed a group of monks and nuns feasting and flirting, the caption reminding viewers that their vows were supposed to forbid both. Another depicted the Pope as a bloated figure surrounded by courtesans, a literal illustration of the whore of Babylon from Revelation. For ordinary people who couldn't read Latin, these images told the story plainly. The church said one thing and did another. and everyone could see it. But satire didn't just belong to Protestants. Catholics themselves sometimes indulged in mocking their clergy. In Spain, La Celestina, a wildly popular work of literature, painted priests and friars as easily corrupted, tangled in lust and greed. The book wasn't banned immediately, because the humor was too relatable to suppress. In England, Geoffrey Chaucer, centuries before the Reformation, had already slipped the theme into the Canterbury Tales. His friar was cheerful, sociable, and suspiciously fond of taverns and women. His partner sold fake relics for profit. Chaucer didn't need to invent much. He just wrote down what everyone saw. Gossip, too, became its own art form. In villages, people whispered about Father So-and-so's housekeeper who looked suspiciously like a wife. In towns, neighbors gossiped about the bishop's children, pretending not to notice their uncanny resemblance. Gossip was a kind of gentle rebellion, a way for ordinary people to acknowledge what the official line denied. And gossip traveled fast. A scandal in a convent might spread through a city in days, woven into jokes, poems, and eventually into court records. Once written down, it became fodder for reformers, satirists, and critics across Europe. One of the most effective tools of mockery was the simple proverb. People distilled centuries of clerical scandal into sayings that needed no explanation. In France, a saying went, "As chaste as a priest's housekeeper," which, of course, meant not at all. In Germany, better a monk in the vineyard than a monk in the cloister, a wink at the fact that monks were often found more often with wine and women than with prayer books. And in England, people joked about Friar Tuck, the jolly companion of Robin Hood character who drank, laughed, and fought, but was notably never depicted as celibate. The humor was affectionate, but cutting. Everyone knew the score. Literature, theater, ballads, proverbs, together they created a cultural picture of the church that was very different from its official image. On Sunday morning, the priest was a representative of Christ. By Sunday afternoon in the tavern or the playhouse, he was a punchline. This dual perception mattered. It meant that when reformers like Luther began to criticize the church, people were ready to listen. They had been laughing at clerical hypocrisy for generations. The Reformation simply turned the laughter into outrage. And yet, it wasn't all mockery. Some people responded with resignation, even comfort. Of course, priests fail, they thought. Everyone does. The familiarity of the scandals made them less shocking over time. Clerical indulgence became part of the landscape of daily life, woven into humor rather than outrage. There's something strangely soothing in that. A reminder that even when institutions proclaimed lofty ideals, ordinary people quietly rolled their eyes, made a joke, and carried on. If we look across centuries, the pattern holds. Medieval ballads, Renaissance plays, Reformation pamphlets, Enlightenment novels, all found space for the lecherous priest, the indulgent monk, the hypocritical bishop. It became a cultural archetype, as recognizable as the greedy merchant, the foolish noble, or the scheming lawyer. When people wanted a laugh at human weakness, the clergy were an easy target. Because, of course, they had given everyone plenty of material. So as we drift further tonight, we can see how the failures of priests and popes didn't just stay within the church. They spilled into culture, into art, into the collective imagination of Europe. The church tried to suppress the laughter, but it never really succeeded. Because once you've heard a ballad about a monk sneaking into a tavern, it's it's hard to forget. Once you've seen a woodcut of a pope surrounded by mistresses, the image lingers. Once you've laughed at a farce about a friar chasing women, the stereotype takes root. And in the end, the culture remembered the contradictions almost as much as the prayers. So let's drift onward. Next, we'll wander into how the Enlightenment and beyond treated these scandals. How philosophers, skeptics, and modern historians have looked back on centuries of clerical indulgence, sometimes with horror, sometimes with humor, and often with a weary shrug. By the time Europe reached the 17th and 18th centuries, clerical scandal had long since stopped being surprising. Popes with mistresses, monks with taverns, bishops with housekeepers, it was all very familiar. The shock had worn off. What remained was the steady drip of irony. But in the Enlightenment, that irony took on a sharper edge. Philosophers, skeptics, and satirists didn't just laugh at the contradictions of celibacy. They turned them into arguments for something much larger, the case against the Church itself. Voltaire, naturally, was at the forefront. Few men enjoyed mocking the clergy quite as much as he did. In his essays, plays, and endless letters, he delighted in reminding readers that priests thundered against sin by day, then indulged by night. His wit was razor-sharp, but delivered with that dry shrug of inevitability. Of course, priests were corrupt. Of course, popes were hypocritical. Why would anyone expect otherwise? In Candide, he filled the story with hypocritical figures in habits and robes. The inquisitor who keeps a mistress. The Jesuit baron who is both noble and self-indulgent. The joke was never subtle, but it didn't need to be. Audiences already knew the material. Voltaire didn't invent clerical hypocrisy. He just polished it into satire that doubled as philosophy. His conclusion was simple. If the guardians of morality can't resist temptation, perhaps the system itself is flawed. Diderot, too, joined the fun. In La Religieuse, the Nun, he told the story of a young woman forced into convent life against her will. Inside the cloister, she encountered not pure devotion, but manipulation, corruption, and illicit affairs. It was fiction, yes, but based so clearly on reality that readers recognized it instantly. Diderot's point wasn't just that vows of celibacy were hard. It was that institutions built on repression inevitably curdle. The convent became less a place of holiness and more a greenhouse of human desire, twisted by confinement. Readers were meant to feel pity, not shock. And then there was the anonymous flood of pamphlets, satires, and jokes that circulated through Europe. Broadsheets painted monks as gluttonous, priests as womanizers, and popes as worldly tyrants. Some were exaggerations, certainly. Others were barely embellished retellings of stories people had heard all their lives. A favorite theme was the confessor seducing the penitent. It had been around for centuries, but Enlightenment satirists gave it new bite. The very sacrament of confession, designed to cleanse the soul, became the perfect stage for irony. The priest tempted precisely where he was supposed to absolve. Another popular target was the cardinal nephew, that recurring figure of nepotism and indulgence. Pamphlets joked that every nephew was suspiciously young, handsome, and well provided for. Readers didn't need it explained. They understood exactly what was being implied. It wasn't just literature. Painters and caricaturists joined in. In London, satirical prints showed portly abbots with overflowing goblets, surrounded by women. In Paris, Caricatures depicted monks stumbling drunkenly out of taverns. In Amsterdam, printers turned out bawdy cartoons of clerics caught in compromising positions. These images weren't intended as accurate portraits. They were shorthand, cultural symbols. A monk with a wine bottle in one hand and a woman on his lap wasn't a specific accusation, it was a universal joke, instantly understood, and like all good satire, it worked because it felt true. By this point, even many Catholics shrugged. They knew reform had been attempted, the Council of Trent had thundered against concubinage. Seminaries had been established. Bishops were supposed to live in their dioceses. And yes, some things had improved. Scandals were less brazen, less visible, but everyone knew they hadn't disappeared. So the Enlightenment didn't uncover new scandals. It simply reframed old ones as proof that religion itself was hollow. There's something strangely soothing about this stage of the story. The anger had passed. The shock was long gone. What remained was a low hum of weary cynicism. Priests were weak, popes were human. The institution promised holiness, but delivered hypocrisy. It was no longer even scandalous, it was expected. Voltaire, Diderot, and their peers didn't rage. They chuckled, sighed, and used the material to argue for reason, science, and secular governance. In their telling, clerical indulgence was just another example of why humanity should stop pretending to be holy and start being honest. Meanwhile, in the parishes and convents, life went on. Priests still kept housekeepers. Bishops still had nephews who were suspiciously well provided for. Nuns still slipped through cloisters when opportunity beckoned. But the cultural response had shifted. Where medieval villagers laughed in taverns, Enlightenment philosophers published books. Where Renaissance pamphlets mocked specific scandals, 18th century satirists used the entire system as a metaphor for human folly. It was less about one pope or one monk, and more about the grand irony of it all. Let's pause to picture an evening in Paris, around 1760. A café, smoky and crowded, with philosophers arguing at wooden tables. Someone quotes Voltaire's latest jab at the church. The crowd laughs not cruelly, not with shock, but with the easy amusement of people hearing a joke they already know. The hypocrisy of priests is background noise, a familiar melody woven into European life. Or picture a London print shop where a new caricature of a drunken friar sells by the dozen. Buyers take it home, pin it to their wall, and chuckle. It's entertainment. It's philosophy. It's also, in its own way, bedtime humor. By the late 18th century, clerical scandals had become part of the argument for secularism. If holy men couldn't keep their vows, how could they claim authority over anyone else? If popes fathered children, why should they dictate morality to others? It wasn't just about sex or indulgence anymore. It was about power, trust, and the legitimacy of institutions. Clerical hypocrisy wasn't a joke in isolation. It was a symbol of why old systems needed to be questioned, reformed, or even overthrown. And yet through it all, the Church endured. Scandals dented its reputation, but they didn't destroy it. Popes continued to reign. Priests continued to preach. Nuns continued to chant. The institution adapted, absorbed the blows, and carried on. History is stubborn that way. Human weakness never quite topples the structures built around it. So, as we drift deeper into the night, we can see the pattern clearly. From medieval taverns to Renaissance banquets, from Protestant pamphlets to Enlightenment satire, The story remained the same. Vows made, vows broken, laughter following close behind. It's a story less about sin than about humanity, the endless cycle of aspiration and failure, of ideals colliding with desire. And perhaps that's why it feels strangely comforting. Because in the end, even popes and priests couldn't resist. Next, we'll drift into our closing stretch. In Part 7, we'll reflect on the modern memory of these scandals, how historians, writers, and even today's bedtime readers look back on centuries of contradiction. Not with rage, not with shock, but with the soft amusement that comes when human folly feels familiar, and even a little soothing. We've wandered quite a distance tonight. From the early councils that first tried to impose celibacy, to the medieval popes who fathered children anyway, to the Renaissance cardinals who lived like princes, to the Enlightenment philosophers who chuckled knowingly at it all. It's been a long, low-lit stroll through centuries of contradiction, and as we settle into the final stretch, perhaps the most soothing realization is this. None of it is surprising, none of it is new, and none of it ever really went away. Modern historians look back on these scandals with a kind of resigned amusement. They don't clutch pearls, they don't gasp in shock. Instead, they sift through papal bulls, parish records, and convent investigations with the weary recognition that, of course, human beings behaved like this. Celibacy was an ideal. Desire was reality, and reality usually won. In fact, when you read the work of contemporary scholars, you notice a gentle tone creeping in. They don't excuse the behavior, but they also don't treat it as uniquely monstrous. They see it for what it was: ordinary weakness wrapped in extraordinary robes. Ask someone today about Pope Alexander VI, and they probably won't recall his theological contributions. They'll remember the Borgias, Lucrezia's supposed poison, Caesare's ruthless campaigns, and Alexander's mistresses. Mention Pope Julius II, and you'll hear about the warrior pope, striding into battle, and maybe the whispers about his young companions. Bring up Leo X, and you'll hear his infamous quote, "Since God has given us the papacy, let us enjoy it." The laughter of Renaissance Rome still echoes in that line. It's telling, isn't it? Centuries later, the scandals outlive the sermons. There's a quiet comfort in how predictable it all was. Every attempt at reform sparked fresh vows of purity. Every vow of purity was eventually broken. Every broken vow became gossip, then satire, then history. It's like watching the tide roll in and out. Institutions insisted on ideals. People fell short. Reformers thundered. And then the cycle began again. In a strange way, the constancy of hypocrisy makes the past feel very human, very relatable. We may not run monasteries or wear papal tiaras, but we recognize the pattern: lofty promises, ordinary failures, and the gentle laughter that follows. Even today, echoes remain. Scandals involving clergy still surface from time to time, and the media reports them with the same weary tone medieval villagers once used in taverns. The costumes have changed, the technology has changed, but the underlying story feels familiar. The difference is that now fewer people are shocked. Centuries of history have prepared us. The Church has weathered it before, and likely will again. And so, instead of outrage, many people respond with a quiet shrug, perhaps a wry smile, the same reaction their ancestors had when the parish priest's housekeeper gave birth to her third child. These stories endure not because they're lurid, but because they're ordinary. They remind us that even at the heights of power, people remain people. The Pope in his marble chamber, the monk in his cloister, the nun behind convent walls, they carried the same desires as everyone else. The difference is that their vows made the contradiction sharper, their failures more ironic, and their scandals more memorable. And irony, as it turns out, makes for excellent bedtime history. So tonight, as we drift toward sleep, let's leave the popes in their candlelit apartments, their mistresses waiting discreetly nearby. Let's leave the bishops in their rectories, their housekeepers bustling about with children underfoot. Let's leave the monks in their taverns, mugs of ale raised a little too cheerfully. They preached purity, but practiced humanity. They thundered against sin, then succumbed to it. They vowed celibacy, but couldn't resist. And that's the quiet comfort of history. Behind every robe, every crown, every vow, there is simply a human being, flawed, foolish, and familiar. So take a breath. Let the contradictions of the past fade gently into the dark, and drift off, knowing that history, in all its scandal and irony, is less about perfection and more about the soothing reminder that imperfection is the most human story of all. And that's where we'll leave things tonight, a long trail of vows made, vows broken, and the gentle irony that even holy men could not resist. If you've drifted all the way here, thank you for keeping me company. Let me know in the comments with a simple "still awake" or, if you're already half asleep, just leave a little emoji. I always enjoy seeing who makes it to the end. If you found this relaxing, feel free to share it with someone who could use a quiet story to unwind with. And of course, subscribing means you won't miss the next late-night wander through history. Now take one last deep breath, let the lights fade, and drift off, knowing the past is never as pure as it pretends to be. Good night, everyone.